Bonjour tout le monde, local et distant. Comment est-ce que tu m'entends?
Oui, très bien.
Et donc, tout est clair. Euh, je vais présenter notre conférencier en français d'abord, et puis brièvement en anglais, et puis ensuite Thomas Serre est titulaire de la chaire Thomas G. Watson Senior en sciences et professeur de sciences cognitives et psychologiques ainsi qu'informatique à l'université Brown University. Il est directeur académique du Center for Computation and Visualization. Il est directeur associé du Center for Computational Brain Science. Il est également titulaire d'une chaire internationale en intelligence artificielle à l'Institut d'intelligence artificielle et naturelle de Toulouse. Ses recherches portent sur la compréhension des calculs neuronaux, dans la perception visuelle, avec un accent particulier sur le rôle des processus récurrents et de rétroaction dans le raisonnement visuel. Le titre de sa présentation que vous avez déjà lu est Mécanisme de rétroaction corticale dans le raisonnement visuel, du regroupement perceptif au raisonnement compositionnel abstrait. Welcome to I want to welcome Thomas to Montreal. Have you been here before, Thomas?
Oh, Montreal is one of my favorite cities in North America. Yes, I've been many times to Montreal.
To here, and I don't know if you've seen it lately, but this is I think this should be showing you. Do you see Mount Royal?
I do not see anything, so cameras are
Oh,
off.
just a second. Why is this not showing?
Okay, I see you now. Okay. Oh, I think it's because your microphone. Now I see you. Yeah.
And do you see the mountain?
Maybe I see Billy. Yes, I see snow. Yes, yes.
Okay, so that's where we are now.
Perfect.
Anyway, you're very welcome here. We're all looking forward to your talk. The theme, of course, of this particular year for this edition of this seminar is touring. But I have a feeling you won't be touching much on touring in your talk.
I'm not going to talk about touring, but I guess some of the work that I'll be presenting, I'd like to think of this as visual versions, I guess, of some of Turing tests, which is really to evaluate AI systems against biological vision.
Which is why we invited you. Est-ce que vous entendez ici dans la salle? Est-ce que c'est assez fort? Normalement, je fais ça seulement. Okay. With that, I pass the driver's seat to Thomas Serre at Brown University.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation and the kind introduction. I was telling Stephen that I have a lot of slides, and usually I tend to dwell on things. I'm not going to go through most of it. So anyway, the point is that I welcome questions during the presentation. I'm happy to stop anywhere in the presentation.
Les questions peuvent se poser en français aussi si nécessaire.
I can, yes, and I'm assuming that I should be speaking or.
You'll be speaking English, but
okay. All right. So I'll answer. Feel free to ask in French, and I'll answer in English, I guess. Okay. And what else was I? Oh, and so I just received a list of questions just a couple of minutes ago, which I was going through, and I have to say that I was pretty impressed by the questions. I can tell that you guys have read papers, not in great depth, and a lot of the questions are pinpointing exact kind of limitations in some of the work we've done. So I was very impressed, and I have to say that I was trying to calibrate my presentation for a very, very broad audience. So I was not planning to get into much detail and really kind of trying to highlight the scope of the work we've done. But so anyway, I hope that I calibrated my presentation appropriately. And if I did not, again, feel free to ask questions or technical details as they arise. All right. So I like to start my I like to start my presentations with a little demo, and I don't know if some of you might have seen those or examples of this psychophysical task called a rapid visual categorization task. And because we're on Zoom, I don't know how well the demo will play, but the idea here is that I'm going to be flashing images very briefly, probably for a few tenths of millisecond. And the rule of the game, if you were a participant in the study, you'd have to, based on this very fast presentation, respond as to whether an animal is present or not in those images. And for the sake of example here, this is done with animals, but you can use almost any kind of category of objects that you want. And so here's the, again, I don't know if this is going through, but you should see images very, very, very briefly flashed. But I hope you can appreciate the fact that, given the speed of presentation, you're probably not able to perceive every single little details in those images, but, in the lab, at least, people would be able to report, what we would call the gist of the scene. Maybe if there is a dominant object, the category of the dominant object in the scene. And the assumption, and part of the reason why this experimental paradigm has been, kind of extensively studied in psychology, is that because psychologists have assumed that pushing our visual system to near its temporal limit, as we do with this very fast presentation. I should also point out that it's not just the presentations that are fast, but in the lab we would require people to respond very, very fast, almost as fast as they possibly can. And the assumption and the body of work that has studied this experimental paradigm suggests that the experimental paradigms highlight our ability to correspond to a core set of visual representations that our visual system builds when we during the first initial phases of visual processing. And the assumption is that during this early phase of visual processing is based on the rapid detection of visual features that are unbound. And so this yield these very kind of coarse and structured visual representations, but that seems sufficient nonetheless to at least kind of guess or get a sense of the dominant object's presence in the scene. I'm having trouble here. Okay. And so what do we know about the underlying brain mechanisms? I'm not going to go over the past, several decades of work in visual neuroscience, but I'll briefly mention a couple of key mechanisms that have been, shown to be important for our ability to classify and categorize images of that sort. We know since at least Hubel and Wiesel and Charlie Gross's work in the 60s and later in the 70s, that a set of visual areas known as the ventral stream of the visual cortex play a critical role in our ability to process visual information of that sort. Those visual areas start at the level of the primary visual cortex, area V1, and then the information flows through a hierarchy of visual areas, secondary visual area V2, V4, and then the visual information and the visual representations culminate at the level of the IT cortex, inferotemporal cortex. And so the assumption is that our ability to classify images of the sort that I showed earlier relies on a gradual buildup of invariant visual feature representation that enables those kinds of rapid visual processing. The key assumption is that in order to build up this core set of visual representation, although we know that cortical areas are almost always reciprocally connected with so-called feedback mechanisms, the assumption is that during this rapid visual processing, the flow of information itself can be well approximated by a single feedforward sweep of activity through the ventral visual stream hierarchy. In terms of modeling, there's a whole, fairly long history of feedforward models, again, dating back from, the late 50s, early 60s, and all the pioneering work of Hubel and Wiesel. This work of Hubel and Wiesel motivated computer vision work in the 80s. Some of you might have heard about Fukushima's neocognitron, which was essentially the first hierarchical feedforward model based on principles identified by Hubel and Wiesel. But Fukushima was able to kind of implement those general ideas and principles into a computer vision model, which arguably was one of the very first kind of successful computer vision models. So it's kind of a story that I often like to tell, the fact that neuroscience, at least in the early days of computer vision, did play a very significant role in the design of computer vision models. So beyond the 80s and Fukushima's neocognitron, I think the following 2 decades, 90s and 2000, saw extension of that kind of general class of models. But the work kind of split along 2 separate routes. On the computer science / AI side, people like Yann Lequin and colleagues, build on Fukushima's ideas to develop, at the time, le net, which is now commonly refers to as convolutional neural networks. And the goal there was really to kind of crank up the engineering on the neocognitron and to really kind of squeeze out every ounce of performance that Yann and his colleagues could squeeze out of those types of architectures. And then on the neuroscience side, several groups, Edmond Rols in Cambridge, Simon Thorpe in France, Tommy Poggio at MIT. And as a side note, I was a graduate student of Tommy Poggio at MIT, so I worked extensively on the HMAX. All of those kind of neuroscience models were extensions of neocognitron, and in a way they were kind of CNN-likes, but the focus there was quite different. Rather than trying to get models that would perform as best as possible on computer vision tasks, the goal was really to kind of constrain those architectures, ground them in biological or neural data, anything related to receptive field sizes, number of layers, number of connections running from one layer to the next, etc., so that they would offer a way to simulate what is currently understood about the inner working of this part of the visual system, the ventral stream of the visual cortex. And so to some extent, I think this was kind of a good time for neuroscience, because we were able to simulate the working of one part of the visual system, this ventral stream of the visual cortex, at least the feedforward part of this part of the visual system, based on neuroscience data, so electrophysiology and anatomical data. And then the main point, and this was the main kind of culmination of my PhD work, was to demonstrate that when you simulate those models, they are sufficient to account for not only the overall performance of human subjects when they solve one of these rapid animal non-animal categorization tasks, but also account for their pattern of correct and incorrect responses. So this was a way to bridge the gap from electrophysiology all the way to behavior. Now, I try to draw this distinction between CNN on the computer science side and those earlier neuroscience models. One thing that is interesting to me, at least, is that the distinction between these 2 classes of models is, I want to say, almost semantic, in the sense that both architectures were relying on the same kind of building blocks, same kind of basic operations. You've all heard about convolution, nonlinear rectification, normalization, pooling operations. All of those are biologically plausible operations in the sense that were shared by both types of architecture. And those operations get cascaded to account for the kinds of invariant, hierarchical, visual feature hierarchies that people are thinking about when we think about rapid visual categorization. Okay, so this was all great for neuroscience. As we all know, meanwhile, so those models essentially kind of stayed as what they were. I moved from grad school to starting my lab at Brown, and then moved on to doing something else, in particular kind of studying everything that goes beyond feedforward processing, better understanding the role of cortical feedback, at least in the visual system. Meanwhile, as we all know, CNN, kind of continued to be developed, and they, quietly or not so quietly led the current deep learning revolution. Now, the main ingredients of this revolution really is about scaling those feed-forward architectures. So very briefly, I'm sure all of you are familiar with, actually, maybe let me see if I can, I was going to try to put a pointer, but okay. I'm sure all of you are familiar with ImageNet. It's 1.2 million training images, thousands of image categories. Perhaps arguably the kind of the challenge / data set that has ignited the modern kind of AI revolution. What I'm showing here on this plot is so two things. The blue bars correspond to the error rates of systems that were entered for the competition for that year. And so the height of the bar reflects, the error metric of the systems. 2012 is the first year when a deep neural network, CNN, was introduced into the competition and won. This was AlexNet with an error rate of 16.4%. And then you see that year after year, as the accuracy of this system, or the error rate of this system, keeps going down. The main engine behind this drop in accuracy, obviously, there was a lot of kind of tweaks and small innovations that went into getting better accuracy. But I think that the best summary that I can offer about what went on behind the hood is what is shown on this kind of red plot here that shows the trends in terms of the depths of the winning architecture for that year. And I hope you can appreciate the fact that when we started in 2012, the CNNs were 8 layers deep, which, by the way, is roughly the depths of your own ventral stream of the visual cortex. But year after year, you see that it's the trend is pretty clear. The deep neural networks get increasingly deeper and deeper, to the point where by 2016, the winning architecture had several hundreds of layers of depths, arguably orders of magnitude deeper than your own visual system. And then I would say that we are past the CNN wave of modern AI. It's all about transformer these days, but I thought I would just show you a plot suggesting that the trends in scaling, now not necessarily just in depth, but I would say overall capacity, number of parameters in those gigantic models, amount of data that goes in training those models, which now is being measured as a kind of global metric with training compute measured in flops, which is what is shown here on the y-axis, versus publication dates on the right, on the x-axis. And I hope you can see that whether it is for vision models in red or language models in cyan, the trend is pretty clear, right? The amount of compute that goes and the scale of the models year after years, increased by somewhere around 4 and 6 kind of every year. And so from 2012, when AlexNet was introduced, to today, we have gone up in scale by several orders of magnitude. All right, so we wanted to assess what this scale is has done for us in terms of understanding and relating those feed-forward processes to biological vision. And so with a number of collaborators on this work, which was just published a few months ago in TICS, we try to assess where the state of the art in AI models and computer vision is at. And so we performed a systematic evaluation of what we thought would be on the order of about 350 representative models of modern AI systems. And so you get a list here. We try to take the whole range from relatively small scale CNNs to larger scale CNNs, transformers, different kinds of pre-training, supervised on ImageNet, self-supervised learning, so on and so forth. And so this slide is a little busy, but I'll try to guide you through the key steps. On the x-axis will be the accuracy measured on ImageNet. And so every square here will correspond to one of those 350 models. And then on the two plots will be on the y-axis different measures of alignment with primate vision. So on this top plot is a metric of neural alignment based on neural data collected in part of the ventral stream in the inferotemporal cortex. I won't tell you exactly how we measure the alignment. I think the details, this is all published, and the details probably don't really matter. But the data, I'll just say briefly, were collected by collaborators at Harvard in the lab of Mark Livingstone. And so for every point, every model gives you an ImageNet level accuracy and versus a metric of neural alignments. On the bottom plot is a similar plot, except that on the y-axis, rather than measuring the alignment between the visual representation of models and neural data, we are deriving our metric for alignment based on human psychophysics data. Again, this is all published, and I'll skim through a lot of details here. I'll just say that we have developed a game, which is called Click Me, which allows us to assess what part of an image drives classification decision when people look at images and have to classify those images. And so what we get out of the game are heat maps. I'll show you a few examples in the next slide. But essentially, we get a heat maps which tell us what part of an image are important for humans to recognize the object in that image. There are explainability methods that we can leverage to try to get at a similar kind of maps for deep neural networks. We call those important maps. The simplest way to get importance map from deep neural network, there's a number of methods, but the simplest method is to leverage the gradient of the model, which gives us a metric of how sensitive the output of the network is for its correct classification, how much its output is sensitive to individual pixels. And so we have a map for humans, we have a map for individual models, and then we can correlate those two maps and then average across many images, and we get a human feature importance alignment map. Irrespective of the metric we use, and we use additional data sets and metric in this paper, I hope you can appreciate the trend, which is that as we go from left to right, we have models that are becoming increasingly more performant on ImageNet. And I should point out that this increase in performance roughly map onto the kind of historical, the chronology. On the left are older, smaller scale CNNs. Going from left to right, we get CNN with very kind of improvements over the years, larger amount of training data, and then the switch around here to transformers, and again to kind of modern self-supervised training methods. I hope you can see that initially the trend was, I guess, good news in the sense that as models were becoming more performant, the alignment with humans was going up, meaning that getting better model at ImageNet led to better models of the visual system. But since a few years ago, the trends have started to reverse. More performant models are becoming, increasingly less or increasingly more misaligned with human vision. I should point out that we have a measure of human accuracy. We didn't derive the measure. This another group got it, but I hope you can see the gray zone here, which correspond to the confidence interval for trained human annotators on the same task. And so essentially we estimated that from the 350 models, about 1/3 of them, about 30%, fall within the human level of accuracy, with and an astonishing 4% are actually outperforming humans. But I want to draw your attention to this cluster of points here, which are models that are superhuman level. They outperform human on the task. But I hope you can appreciate then when you look at the strategy that they've learned, there is actually no, or in fact, negative correlation between the part of the image that they look at and the part of the image humans care about, suggesting that whatever visual strategy they learn to solve this task turned out to be actually quite, almost corresponding to leveraging complementary part of the image compared to humans. All right, so okay, so just to give you, and I should probably speed up a little bit, but just to give you a little bit of a visualization of that kind of metric of alignment, you get a few representative images here from ImageNet. You get the kind of click-me maps that we get from human subjects. You can see that humans will tend to select things like facial components for animated objects. And then this is what you get in terms of importance maps for, what was at the time, this was published already a few years ago, but these were representative kind of state-of-the-art models at the time. I hope I can easily, from just visual inspection, convince you of the fact that, you know, whatever strategy is discovered by, deep neural networks does not look quite like the strategy used by human observers. A lot of it tends to be much more distributed in terms of what deep neural network leverage, mixing, you know, different parts of the foreground, different part of the object that most of the time does not agree with the part of the object that humans find diagnostic. And a lot of the time, you know, there are or important pixels will fall on the background. As a side note, we know that there is a lot of shortcuts on ImageNet, and you know, I'll say casually that I think a lot of the superhuman level deep neural networks are able to learn visual features that are superhuman in the sense that they turn out to be diagnostic in getting to the final kind of bit of accuracy those models can get on ImageNet, but there are potentially features that are not even potentially perceptible by a human observer. Okay, so the point that I'm trying to make is that, you know, modern scaled AI systems seem to have, you know, discovered strategies that are becoming increasingly misaligned with the strategies leveraged by human observers. And I think part of the issue is that, you know, the way the scaling of complexity is achieved by those deep neural network is really through kind of physical, architectural, either depth or capacity constraints, right? I made the point earlier that some of these networks are now orders of magnitude deeper than our own visual system. I made the claim that our visual system turned out to be a much shallower hierarchical processing pipeline. And in general, the assumption I would like to put forward, or the hypothesis that I would like to put forward, is that obviously people can improve visual analysis beyond this, you know, rapid visual processing, single feed-forward sweep of activity. And so in a way, our visual system, or we are able to modulate the depths at which we process a visual scene, but we don't do that through static depth or capacity, you know, architectural capacity constraints, but we do that by allowing kind of recurrent reentrant signals. And so this increase in processing depth is really done dynamically through cortical feedback. I'll briefly mention that there's two kinds of cortical feedback. There is cortical feedback, which I will refer to as top-down, that runs from higher level visual areas or processing stage onto lower processing stages or area. So we call those top-down connections, as well as so-called horizontal connections that will run within a processing stage, right? So what I have in mind, and I'll show you a few more details later on, are connections that allow the linking of, you know, neurons within a processing stage. And I forgot to mention earlier when I gave you this 2-minute overview of the ventral stream, for the large part in our visual system, neurons are topographically organized, right? That's the concept of retinotopy. Nearby neurons encode nearby position in the visual field. And so the assumption is that those horizontal connections allow connections not just locally from one stage to the next, as you would find in a CNN, but it allows communication across neighbors within that processing stage. The assumption that we and many others have is that those kinds of feedback reentrant mechanism allow the visual system to go beyond an unbound, unstructured visual representation toward a representation of the scene that has been perceptually organized. And so the assumption is that those kinds of processes require mechanisms such as attention, grouping, working memory, things that are largely missing in convolutional neural networks. And I think it remains an open question if and when those kinds of mechanisms arise from transformer architecture. Another point that I would like to make is that I think the over-reliance on feed-forward processing and static depth has largely been driven by image categorization tasks like ImageNet and the corresponding challenges, which I think have been obscuring the critical need for perceptual organization and that is needed for visual reasoning beyond image categorization. Image categorization might be one of those tasks in vision for which cortical feedback, perceptual organization might not be necessary, and perhaps this is why we're able to solve those tasks so well even when we are forced to operate in a feed-forward sweep. But I think the field need to think a little bit more critically, and so in part this is why in the past few years my lab has been focusing on the development of what could look like naive cognitive benchmarks, which are kind of very simple, stimuli, black and white, simple colors. Most of those benchmarks are trivial for human subjects, but I hope to show you in the next few slides kind of representative examples of that line of work that have highlighted the limitation of current AI systems, and I hope the need for thinking beyond feed-forward processing and scale towards the benefits of adding some form of feedback mechanism. So the first, and I won't have time, unfortunately, to go through all of those kind of cognitive benchmarks and what they tell us about the need for feedback mechanisms. I'll start briefly with an example of this task, which PSVRT stands for Parametric Synthetic Visual Reasoning Task, which is perhaps the simplest form of visual reasoning that we could formalize as a clean, well-controlled computer vision task. All right, so here is a version of the task. Here the idea is to present or to generate stimuli for which we can formulate two form of visual reasoning using the same exact stimuli and in a way to avoid a possible confound, which would be that any difference in the computational requirements or the computational demand of those tasks could be associated to different statistics, for instance, low-level statistics of the visual stimuli themselves. Here we have formulated this same difference versus spatial reasoning task that use the same exact stimuli. And so you see example of stimuli here. The stimuli are made of items. Here we're showing 2 items, but in practice we can show an unlimited number of items. The items are very simple. They're just black and white patterns. The spatial reasoning task is relatively simple. The idea is that if we were to draw some kind of a line here through the set of stimuli, the learner would have to figure out whether the arrangement is more horizontal or vertical, right? So very simple task. The same different task involve making a judgment about whether the individual patterns are all the same or at least one is different. Now, the reason why we focus on those 2 tasks is we thought that they would pose very different challenges for convolutional neural networks and perhaps modern AI system more broadly. As we all know, CNN are essentially, they build a hierarchy of feature detectors or template matching operations. And so whatever visual reasoning they do will have to be done through filter banks that they learn. And they'll have to rely on these filter banks to detect specific configuration of those items. Our assumption was that in the case of spatial relations, right, there is a relatively small number of templates, and I showed a couple of examples here, that could be used to solve the task. So here's a very simple filter of, you might have seen R filters or Gabor filters before, and there are, variants of those where you would have positive subfields and negative subfields. And so here would be an arrangement that would allow, easily a neural network to figure out whether things are vertically or horizontally aligned, just in the spirit of how we used in the good old days to do edge detection, for instance. In comparison, our assumption is that for a same different task, because the templates would have to look a little bit different. We call those the subtraction templates. Essentially, the network would have to learn templates associated with all possible relative arrangements of items. As you can see here, they correspond to much smaller receptive fields. And so now because the number of arrangements of items on the screen will grow quadratically, for instance, with a window size, if we define a window over which those items can appear, um, and exponentially with the number of items we can display, you see that as soon as we start varying allowing larger windows and more items, we are creating, in effect, a combinatorial explosion in the number of stimuli we can generate. And so our assumption is that when we create this explosion in the number of stimuli we can produce, any system that is relying on template matching mechanism will essentially, there will be a point where whatever is the capacity of that network, we should be able to generate more stimuli, more images than the number of templates that the network can store. And so we verified that. We showed that for CNN, same different judgments are offer or provide or a critical drop once we pass or exceed, when we create stimuli that appear on a window such that so I would call that a critical cliff. We find configuration of CNN for which they are able to solve the task without any problem. They can be trained easily to solve the task. But then if we create this explosion, we find that there's a critical cliff and the networks are no longer able to learn, presumably because the number of possible samples and templates they would have to store exceed their capacity. And so we use this, the capability of CNN feedforward mechanism to solve and learn spatial reasoning versus same different task as evidence that perhaps if we were to evaluate human subjects, our prediction is that they should be able to form and learn to solve a spatial reasoning task with very limited attentional demand and memory load, as opposed to same different tasks for which our prediction is that they will require much greater attentional demand and memory load. Very quickly, I'll skip through that, but I'll just say that around the time where we published this work, there was extensions of CNNs that were published for CNNs to be able to, enabling CNN to seemingly solve very complex visual question answering tasks. But we had noticed that the CNNs were always trained and tested on the same set of shapes and textures and colors. And in a sense, none of those architectures were really evaluated for their ability to learn and abstract rules beyond statistical associations between visual input, visual features, and class label. And so with the right kind of control, making sure that we would keep some of the combinations of shape and color out of the training set for those models, we showed that in all cases, we could get those models to fit the data set, the training data perfectly if we train for long enough. But in all cases, they failed to generalize to a novel combination of shape and color, for instance, even though they had seen those shapes and those colors during training, only they had never seen this very specific combination of shape and color. Again, suggesting that there is no real generalization, that those architecture just really fit the training data without really learning the rule. This problem remains. There was a sense for a while, that transformers were, solving much of those challenges that we had highlighted. But just this is not our work. This is work published by another group just a few years ago using transformers on one of the synthetic visual reasoning tasks, where they showed that the network could reach perfect, even test accuracy on the benchmark. But by simply moving individual shape by as little as 1 or 2 pixels, the network were going from perfect classification to complete kind of random decision. Again, suggesting that it's likely that those networks are in a way rote memorizing the training data without really learning to reason about those scenes. again, for reasons that go beyond my understanding, we've been making a lot of people upset. I think a lot of people wanted to prove that, you know, AI can learn, you know, to solve the simple task without any issue. And to make a long story short, you know, yes, in practice, you can help those neural networks, feed-forward neural network, to learn those kinds of tasks. People have shown that if you pre-train CNN and especially transformers on a lot of data, or if you run meta-learning on a lot of different visual reasoning tasks on CNN, or if you had all kinds of hacks, things that would approximate the kinds of attentional mechanisms that we think are going on in primate vision, you can get those architectures to learn the task if you fine-tune them on the task. But I want to emphasize that it still takes them, you know, always on the order of tens or hundreds of thousands of examples. And so I think this, you know, the fact that they can solve the task is still going beside the point that we have been trying to make, which is the fact that those tasks remain trivial. You can go all the way down to very small brains. And I gave a list of animals and insects here: bees, wasps, crickets, birds, primates, and even some fish have been solved to be able to solve this kind of same different task. And they can learn to solve those tasks with, you know, in the limit, sometimes a handful of training examples, right? So there's still a major gap between what, you know, small brains biology can do and what those, you know, scaled up feed-forward neural network can do. In the extreme, there was a paper published, you know, now some 10 years ago by Martino III and Kalsenik in Science, where they showed that they could shortcut the imprinting reflex in duckling, right? They could wiggle pairs of 3D shape, and you see example here, I hope. They could imprint the duckling on a pair of shape that would correspond to either an abstract same relation or an abstract different relation. And they show that later on, you know, if given after the training period from a single exposure, the ducklings were able to generalize to novel combinations of shape and or color. So again, evidence that newborn duckling from single exposure, from a single pair, either same or different, they could learn to generalize beyond the physical appearance, the color or the shape of the stimuli. In other words, they can learn an abstract rule from a single kind of exposure. All right, so what is enabling brains to solve those tasks so much more, you know, efficiently than, you know, even the best AI systems? As I mentioned earlier, and I hope it's clear, you know, our visual system is able to organize even a simple visual scenes, like a scene containing the simple items, perceptually. We're able to individuate objects. We're able to bound visual features associated with individual items to a high-level structured representation of those items. We're able to represent those items in working memory and then manipulate those representation effectively. That allows us to learn and solve those tasks so efficiently. So we teamed up with collaborators in Toulouse, Rufin Van Roelen and Andrea Lamia, who was a postdoc in Rufin's lab at the time. And we set to test our prediction that same different tasks would require some of the mechanisms, attention and working memory, that are hypothesized to be needed in order to individuate items, so that the attentional demand and memory load should be greater for same different task over spatial reasoning task. So I'll go very fast through the detail. I'll just say that we had to make small tweaks to our items so that, you know, they could be manageable by humans. So we use this exominos, but same idea. We controlled fully for you know, low-level stimulus differences by formulating those two versions, same difference and spatial reasoning task on the same set of stimuli. Andrea trained CNN just like we did and reproduced our results. It showed that spatial reasoning could be learned very efficiently. The same different task, well, the CNN seemingly learned, but when he tested generalization, the generalization here of the CNN for the same different task is this red curve here. You see that we feed the training data, but we don't generalize if we test them on novel kind of items, right? In other words, again, they're learning statistical associations between visual features and class label, but not really abstracting away the rule. we also propose a very kind of toy extension of CNN. Our best attempt at accounting or modeling the kinds of structured representation that could come from individuation and perceptual grouping. Here, the idea is very simple, is that instead of feeding an image as a single channel to a CNN, we just kind of spoon feed the CNN with pre-individuated items. And so essentially we split all the items into individual channels. And so before we feed that to the CNN, this is not meant to be a realistic model of attention, obviously, but just to show that the expected behavior of a CNN if the scene has been perceptually organized in the way that each items can be processed by its own feature channel that is bound in memory to its associated object representation. And so what you see here is the training of these models, but now the model is able to, who is individuating the representation, who is perceptually organizing the scene, is able to generalize without any problem. Rufin and Andrea did, very systematic work. They controlled for everything they could. They ran a staircase experiments to make sure that there wouldn't be any kind of low-level differences between the tasks that could account for any kind of differences we could find in terms of neural signature. Here they run an EEG study where they looked at what we call the frequency power spectrum. So this is recording from EEG channels that are across the head, looking at the frequency bands that are getting. So this is the difference between the frequency bands that are activated during the SD task, the same different task, minus the spatial reasoning task. What you see here is that somewhere around 250 and 950 milliseconds in the lower beta band, we find, so these are areas corresponding to occipitoparietal regions within frequency bands, beta bands, that are typically associated with attentional demand and working memory. So we take those as signatures of perceptual grouping. And again, this is validation of the hypothesis that we had made that same different judgments require greater attentional demand and working memory, presumably because they require people to perceptually organize the scene and individuate individual objects. Okay. So with that said, hopefully everyone is on board with the fact that we need to go beyond unbound feature detection for solving some of those more challenging visual reasoning tasks. And so the question is, for biology, what are the underlying computational mechanisms that allow for this sort of perceptual organization? And so the answer that I'm going to try to give you here is that I think those mechanisms require cortical feedback that are largely lacking in current kind of modern AI systems. So I already mentioned earlier that there are two kinds of feedback mechanisms, what we call top-down mechanisms that run from higher level processing stages, visual area, onto lower processing stages, as well as so-called horizontal connections that runs within a processing stage that are essentially corresponding to connections within nearby, what we would call cortical columns, or within nearby neurons that respond to nearby location in space. Remember that in vision, neurons analyze visual scenes through small apertures called receptor
Thomas,
field.
can I interrupt just for a second? I don't know if it will resonate, but this might be a good time to ask people if they have any questions.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
We'll take just does anybody want to make a comment or ask a question at this point? Okay, it sounds like either they're all understanding or
or they are completely lost. Yeah, one of the two.
Go ahead, please.
Okay, so let's see. I have about 10 minutes. Is that?
Well, no. Because you are taking questions in principle,
okay.
you can go on.
Okay. All right. So, well, I'll go as long as you let me go. So, all right. So how to add uh, feedback in a feed-forward architecture? So, I try to spare you all the kind of body of work we and many others have gone on. There's been a lot of work in computational neuroscience trying to model those kinds of horizontal and top-down connections. Here I'll just very briefly mention to give you a little bit of a flavor for what that entails. Remember that in your visual system, you have cortical columns. So you have pyramidal cells essentially organized within those hyper columns. Individual cells respond to individual features, things like different orientations, different color opponencies, disparities, direction of motion, etc. Those tend to be organized in cortical columns where all the cells share the same receptive field, so they respond to the same part of the visual field. And then nearby columns contain the same kind of battery of neurons, feature detectors, but now with receptive fields corresponding at slightly different location. In CNNs and transform, so in CNNs, you have convolutional feature maps. You can think of those cortical columns akin to feature channels, right? If you were to look at the convolutional maps, you can pick one location and then go in depth, look at the response of multiple feature channels. This is kind of the closest visualization that I can offer for the cortical column. And so in CNNs, the way neurons kind of integrate information over space through those convergent feed-forward connection, right? We start with relatively small receptive field, and then through hierarchical pooling mechanisms, receptive fields grow, which allow neurons to analyze, process, learn spatial dependencies over greater and greater regions of space. So the integration of or the learning of spatial dependencies is done through depths. In the visual system, in the visual cortex, neurons are connected within cortical columns, but also across nearby cortical columns. Think of that as a small kind of radius of maybe 5 to 10 cortical columns. Those neurons are kind of densely reciprocally connected. Which means that unlike in a CNN where all the neurons process their own little part of the image independently, in the visual system, there's a very extensive kind of communication between neighbors. And because those neighbors are connected to neighbors, if you look at the spontaneous activity in the primary visual cortex, you'll find those waves of activity, right? So through horizontal connections, neurons will exchange information, and potentially, neurons at one end of the visual field can be passing, through neighbors and neighbors and neighbors, information all the way to pretty far away neurons that are nonetheless on the same same level of the hierarchy. Again, in CNN, you would have to go potentially all the way up to the output of the visual system to get neurons that are large enough to be able to capture this kind of long-range dependencies. Okay, so how do we model those kinds of connections? Usually you go through systems of differential equations where you model population of excitatory inhibitory neurons. I don't expect you to necessarily follow those differential equations. I'll just highlight one aspect, which is that the rule of the game here is to figure out how to wire those neurons both within and across cortical columns. So when you instantiate that into a modern AI system, that means that there is the feed-forward drive of neurons, through their receptive fields, but then there's another kind of kernel or tensor that needs to be applied on these feature maps where connections across neighbors kind of allow for the exchange of information over time. And I'll show you examples of kind of dynamics that you get out of those models. We used to implement this computational neuroscience model through differential equation solvers and all that stuff. Kind of one of the big breakthrough, I would say, for us from deep learning is that there's been a lot of work on kind of discrete approximation of this dynamical system with a kind of standard recurrent neural networks. You might have also heard about gated recurrent units, LSTM. All these are kind of exciting tools, I think, for computational neuroscientists because they allow us to turn those kinds of neuroscience recurrent neural circuits into and for which we had to tweak the parameters. All the pattern of connectivity had to be tweaked by hand by what we used to call graduate student descent. We had graduate student literally, looking at electrophysiology studies and then trying to figure out the balance of excitation and inhibition that, could lead to a good model of that part of the visual system. Now we can just approximate or code the backbone of this neural circuit into something like PyTorch or TensorFlow, and then allow the magic and the deep learning toolbox to automatically learn all those parameters, all those recurrent connections directly from data. And so here I'm showing you an example on horizontal connections, but in general, we also have top-down connections. We've done a lot of work trying to understand computationally, tease apart the computational role of horizontal and top-down connection. I'm not going to have time to go through the details. I'll just show you what I think is a representative example of what can come out of this line of work. So here we train so we took a relatively shallow CNN, something like just, I think, 3 layers of processing. And then we slapped in one of our little recurrent neural circuits. We added recurrent connection. And then we optimize end-to-end this whole hierarchy for a visual task, which in this case is contour detection. So we train the models on a database of about 500 natural images. Together, this is supervised, so we had kind of ground truth human contour, which is the standard ways that people were training system at the time. This was a few years ago for image segmentation. So what is interesting, so there's been a lot of work, as you would expect. In fact, state-of-the-art deep convolutional neural network back then were already achieving human level of accuracy. And so I guess with our relatively shallow recurrent feedback model, we are also able to achieve human level of accuracy. But what is more interesting here is what happens when you start reducing the amount of training data available to the models. You find that if you start removing some of the training data, all the models, so GammaNet is our feedback network, BDCN it was the leading feedforward CNN at the time. Both systems start to drop, their accuracy start to drop if we remove some of the training data compared to humans. But you see that there is now starting to be a bigger benefit for a system that leverages, feedback connections as opposed to kind of brute forcing depth here. To make this point more explicit here, for a fixed level of accuracy, you see that with a system with feedback, you can achieve the same level of accuracy as the system with feedforward with only 1/10 of the amount of training data. And so I want to show you that those kinds of feedback systems behave very differently from what modern AI systems, from the way modern AI systems behave. In feedforward models, you pipe in an image and then you generate an output image which contain the final output. Here, those feedback networks achieve their computation through time, right? So you start with the first time step after something like 10 milliseconds. The system starts. So this is an example of natural images. Here you see the output of the system, at the initial time step, and you see that the model initially just make its best guess about what could be contour, non-contour, and obviously it's very noisy. But you see that over time, from left to right, the system seems to be discovering a strategy where gradually the false contours from the background tend to gradually get suppressed, while the foreground contour, the object contours, tend to be strengthened. Any missing kind of occluded missing contour gets filled in, and then after just a few time steps here, I think we allow for 8 time steps, which means that a neuron can communicate with all the way to 8 column far, and you see that it approximates fairly well what humans do. More interestingly, in terms of thinking about Turing test, visual Turing test, and similarity dissimilarity with humans. So here we have 2 systems, a recurrent feedback model and a purely kind of deep feedforward model that achieve human level of accuracy on contour detection. However, there is an interesting sensitivity to humans to a visual illusion known as the tilt illusion. And I don't know if you have heard about this illusion before. I also should point out that the illusion is frequency, so distance dependent. And so depending on your viewing distance, you may or may not experience the illusion. But here it is. You have two vertical grading here. At the top, the vertical grading is embedded in a surrounding grading that has a little bit of a tilt to the right. When the angular difference between the center grading and the surround, when the angular difference is small, typically the surround will tend to repel the center. And so if the illusion works, which I hope it does for you, the center grading should appear tilted somewhat to the left. It's getting repelled away from the right tilted surround. When you increase the angular difference between the center and the surround, the effect kind of decreases past a point, and then interestingly, it reverses. So in this case here, where the angular difference between the center and the surround remains large, the surround starts attracting the center, and so your perception of the center should be tilted to the right. Those effects are small. I didn't put this, so this is the psychophysics data. Initially, if you measure the shift in perception from ground truth, there's a repulsion effect. So this is when this part, when people see a repulsion to the left, this is attraction to the right. What is interesting is that we find qualitatively, not quantitatively, but qualitatively, we find a similar trend. Initial repulsion followed by further attraction. For the feedback recurrent model, we find no effect whatsoever in the feedforward model, which is interesting because when you think about the visual illusion, in a sense, so it allows us to say two things. First of all, it seems to be tying the illusion to, strictly speaking, to cortical feedback. But second of all, when you think about the illusion, it appears to be a bug more than a feature, right? After all, this is a case where your perception deviates from the ground truth. At the same time, what I'm about to show you here is that when you ablate the effect, so we spare you the details, but when we try to correct the model for the illusion, and the way we do this is by fine-tuning the model so that the model sees the ground truth orientation. So in other words, we correct the tilt in the model, and then we go back to the contour detection task and then fine-tune the model so that we can still do contour detection. We find that in all cases, removing the sensitivity of the feedback model for the illusion reduces its accuracy on the contour detection task. So I don't know how clear I was, but what I'm trying to say is that it seems that this tilt illusion requires feedback, and it seems to be a feature more than a bug, because when we remove the sensitivity of the model for the illusion, there's a corresponding drop in the accuracy of the model for contour detection. So our explanation is that illusion, such as the tilt illusion, is kind of an edge case. It's the byproduct of a neural circuit, the kinds of recurrent circuit found in our visual system that are essentially optimal for grouping and contour detection in natural everyday vision. They are optimal in natural everyday vision, but on edge cases, for instance, on these illusions, when the statistics of the input deviates from the statistics of natural images, then the perception deviates from the ground truth, but those are largely kind of edge cases rather than bugs. We can also kind of go back to seeing what the network actually learned. And so what I'm showing you here is the pattern of horizontal connection that is learned by the model. So this is not a filter, right, from the feedforward drive. Every square here corresponds to a different cortical column in the model. And so what you see here is that the model has learned a strategy where nearby cortical column near the center get activated through mutual excitation, and that the pattern of connectivity reverses past a certain distance. And we have a number of control that shows that if we change the statistics of the input, or if we make all kinds of lesions in the model, that particular pattern disappears. And so what is interesting is that around the time where we published, a group led by Shetty and Harvey published a paper in Nature doing optogenetic stimulation in the mouse visual cortex, where they run literally the same experiment that we had run in our model. They stimulated one neuron and look at the corresponding effect of that stimulation on nearby neurons and columns, and found the same exact pattern as we found, which is near excitation within neighbors and long range kind of inhibition. Okay, we can also train that circuit on, rather than contour detection, here we took the same exact circuit. We took a leading feedforward network and then slapped in our recurrent circuit and train it for, or fine tune it for what is called panoptic segmentation, where the idea is to label every pixel according to this class label. Obviously, we're not telling the network how to solve the task. We're just optimizing it for the task. What you see here is the solution discovered by the recurrent or the feedback network. Remember that the original feedforward network would solve the task through depth. You input an image and it outputs a map where the color of the pixels corresponds to the label of the matching pixel. Here, the feedback model discovers a completely different strategy where the computation is done through time. And you see that the network seems to have discovered what I would call a flood filling strategy, or a spread of attention, where the model seems to be starting somewhere around the center of mass of objects, and then activation spreads across neighboring columns all the way up to the point where the network kind of hit the boundary of the objects, and then the segmentation stops. We have done further analysis and quantitative comparison between that flood filling or spread of attention strategies against human subjects. The human subject data were not collected by our lab. They were collected in Peter Rolzema's lab in the Netherlands. But the gist of the human data, which are consistent with the model, so here I should maybe explain the task. So the task here is you have images of that sort, contour images of that sort. Participants are fixating on a fixation spot, and then they are shown one other spot. So each one of these 6 possible alternatives. Half of the time, the other dot falls on the same object, same surface. So the subjects have to respond yes, the 2 dots fall on the same object, or no when the second dot falls on a very similar but different kind of object. What is interesting with the pattern of response of humans is that the reaction time is a monotonic function of the distance between the dots and the fixation, consistent with the idea of kind of a spread of attention with some subtleties. And the subtleties is that there is also an interesting phenomenon whereby the spread of attention can be modulated by other factors than just the sheer distance. One of the factors is essentially how narrow literally the gap is for the attention to spread. And so, for instance, in this condition C, where the gap to reach this point is much narrower than in B, you find that people will be slower in C than they are in B. And what is mesmerizing to me, and certainly not something that I have good explanation for, but the model seems to be kind of spontaneously, after training, just at least qualitatively exhibiting a similar patterns of response than human observers. Okay. I'm going to show you one last example, unless I'm being told to stop.
I'm not telling you to stop, although the time will run out.
Okay.
But please go on.
Okay. So one last example.
What I'll do after this example, I really will. I'll stop it and I'll call for some of the people who already asked you questions in the list that you have. Either ask them directly or else even say their name and you can take it from the list.
Okay, sounds good. All right. So very briefly, I want to show you one final kind of cognitive reasoning task. So we call this Planko, and I should give credit for David Scheinberg for really kind of developing this task and most importantly training non-human primates, monkeys, to solve this task. So so here's the task. the idea is that as a participant, you would see, planks here that I hope you can see. You have one, in some version of the task, we have one basket, sometimes we have two baskets. And then the job of the participant is given a initial ball position, which would be this cyan ball here, without seeing the ball falling, is to respond whether that ball is going to fall inside or outside of the basket, or in some version of the task, which of two possible baskets the ball is falling into. The way monkeys are trained is that they first just see a static version of the stimulus, just the initial ball condition. They respond yes or no, or basket A, basket B, and then after that, during the training, they see the ball kind of falling, but of course only after they have responded, and just as a way for the monkey to learn what is expected of them, right? So the assumption is that in order to solve the task, because the task has to be solved from a static stimulus, participants, human or non-human participants, have to mentally simulate the ball falling, predict its trajectory to figure out whether it's falling outside in this case or outside of the basket. So David has done some amazing job training, two monkeys. The monkeys can be trained. They need to follow a curriculum where essentially they are started with a single plank, and so the task is kind of very simple, but they master that single plank. So this is shown in different color here. They first master in one session a one plank condition, then a second plank is added, in a different session. The level of accuracy drops down to chance, but then after enough training, again they reach out the level, satisfactory level of accuracy, and then past the magical number, which seems to be around 3, 4, then they reach kind of ceiling where they can now generalize to almost any number of planks. In other words, they kind of learn the task, and they now can generalize to novel versions of the task, whether it's kind of moving the planks, changing the number of planks, changing the ball position, the basket position, and all those things. Okay. My graduate student, Alec Ashok, trained both our own, so what is called RNN here was really for the kind of the papers to simplify, but this is really our simple feedback neural network with horizontal and top-down connection. So Alec trained both a CNN and an RNN on that task. Again, I want to emphasize the fact that the networks never saw, unlike the monkey that was trained with versions of the, actually seeing the ball falling, none of the neural network ever saw the ball falling. All they were trained on is on static, images of that sort with a ball, two baskets, and then with just two alternative force choice, left or right. Okay, what is interesting is that when we look, so both networks can learn that task. When we look at importance maps, so we look at what part of the image are driving decision for CNN and RNN, we see that the two models are following very different strategy. The CNN end up just broadly attending to the planks and the baskets, all of them, and so we think the CNN are developing probably a more kind of holistic, pre-attentive strategy where they probably kind of guesstimate where the general orientation of the planks, and then based on that they're going to guess it's more left or more right. The RNN, however, as I hope you can see, seem to discover a strategy where they seem to be attending to position that seem to be falling quite closely to where the ball is expected to fall. And indeed, Alec did further experiment where, so you see a case here where this is a fixed scene. He's moving the ball position around, and then is letting the RNN kind of solve the task now through time, right? Through time steps, and so he trains the decoder. I forgot to mention that we get the ground truth ball trajectory by just using a physics engine running through a simulator. So we have the expected ball trajectory, and then we train a decoder on the latent activations of the RNN, and we find that we can actually generalize to novel trials, generalize and correctly read out the ball position simply from the latent activation of the neural network, suggesting that not only is the neural network kind of seemingly attending to possible ball position, but there is enough information in the latent of the model that it allows you to, fairly well, it's not perfect prediction of the ball trajectory. The ball trajectory is in red. The decoded predicted ball trajectory from the latent of the RNN is in blue, but it's close enough. And so to me, it's kind of amazing that from such kind of under constraint specification of the task, just seeing ball position planks, figuring out whether you have to say left or right, this is enough information for the network to kind of spontaneously discover a mental simulation strategy. Sorry.
Okay, now I suggest that this would be
okay, great.
Because you're entitled to a reward for your presentation, and the reward is to get good questions.
Okay, so I'll just give you the key takeaways. I try to make the case that the feedforward models achieve rapid unbound pre-attentive type of recognition, which I try to convince you that is consistent with the kind of rapid visual categorization processing that takes place in primates with the right experimental paradigm. I've highlighted the scaling paradox, where AI has kind of scaled up those the feedforward mechanisms, computations that have been postulated to be responsible for this kind of pre-attentive visual processing steps to the extreme where now models are superhuman, but they are no longer approximating any very well underlying biological representations or biological computations. I've tried to argue that cortical feedback is the missing ingredient on those architectures, and that this is needed if you truly want to achieve robust and generalizable visual reasoning. I've shown you fairly quickly some examples where feedback models can do very well at perceptual grouping and simulation. I cut it short on this mental simulation, but I could have shown you that even transformers can learn the task, but they can learn in one configuration, and they do not generalize to configurations where you change the position of the basket, you change the position of the ball, etc. So my argument is that all these models, CNN transformers, they really fit the data set, right? But they don't really learn the task in a way that will allow them to generalize to just very small reparameterization of the task. And then I didn't tell you at all about it, but I'm pretty excited about some of the recent work we've done, which is completely unpublished, but leveraging some of the latest trends that are happening in the field. You might have heard about SSM, state space models, which are linear approximation of dynamical system. We're starting to be able to take advantage of some of those approaches to allow us now to scale up our feedback network and to train them at scales that are starting to approach the scale of that is being used for training a modern AI system. And I hope we'll be able to convincingly demonstrate that adding those kinds of feedback has a benefit even at scale in comparison to those feed-forward kind of AI systems. Thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Very rich presentation. We already have some questions here. I just want to tell you not to despair if there's not time for questions, because the recording will be available to everybody, and there were many people who were notified about it that couldn't come at exactly this time, but they will be going to your. And they have an advantage because they can stop it and they can think about it. Yours went so fast.
I'm sorry, I might have been.
That's okay, but it was excellent. Now let's take the first question. Say your name. Tu peux poser en français ou en anglais.
Ouais, parler en français.
Oui.
Julien, du coup.
Fort, s'il te plaît.
Plus fort? Vous m'entendez, Thomas?
Oui, je t'entends.
Merci pour votre présentation. C'est un peu fouillis mes questions, mais déjà je vais voir si j'ai bien compris un peu. Donc au début vous expliquez que justement les grands modèles de langue actuellement ils ont du mal avec peut-être ce qu'on pourrait en cognition on dissocie pas mal la syntaxe et la sémantique. Normalement dans l'un de vos articles vous en parlez. Et avec les architectures feed-forward uniquement, j'ai l'impression que justement c'est super pour comprendre la syntaxe, prédire des séquences, etc. Et c'est pour ça qu'éventuellement, dans les tâches de spatial relationship, ils sont meilleurs. Et qui seraient peut-être moins bons dans les tâches de discrimination l'identification d'objets qui repose plus sur une composante sémantique. C'est ça peut-être votre point au début qui fait que ces architectures sont limitantes et qu'il faut implémenter du coup en s'inspirant des neurosciences, des mécanismes attentionnels et des mécanismes de mémoire avec des récurrences ou d'autres couches. Première chose, ici, est-ce que c'est ça l'idée
Oui, c'est ça l'idée. Alors, je suis pas sûr, j'aurais presque dit inverser la syntaxe et la sémantique, mais je ne veux pas jouer avec les mots. Mais bon, peu importe. Oui, alors, donc, pour être clair, oh, sorry, I should answer in English, I guess. So just to be, so the question was, there seems to be a parallel between the story that I posed related to spatial relation versus same different, and that there's an analog in language with semantic and syntax. And so yes, I guess I should be careful about not overclaiming. So I have to confess that every time I made a statement about where AI was heading with scale, whether it could solve X or Y, I was always proven wrong. So I would never or no longer attempt to predict where AI is going through scaling. It's very possible that through scaling, some of the mechanisms that we're postulating that are happening in the brain, attention, working memory that requires some form of recurrence, state representation, feedback. It's very possible that a transformer will find a way to approximate some of those mechanisms. In fact, I was talking, one of my graduate students has done follow-up work with transformers, which I cited in passing, but didn't get through. And in fact, what you see is that the models, the transformers that have been trained with, it seems that it has very little to do with the specific of the architecture or the data set, but more scale, more training data. They seem to learn a strategy where they really learn those kind of very localized templates that I postulated. But the difference with transformer is that, unlike the CNN, they have some of they have in theory, the operations or computations that are needed to manipulate those representations. And so what we find is that, yes, we scale, they learn this they learn to approximate a spotlight of attention, which is what we think the visual system is doing. And then through the attention ahead, they seem to be learning just fine to manipulate those representations. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that, I don't know about, it's very possible that, the next iteration, when we start training, transformers on the entirety of YouTube videos and every, image ever, every picture ever posted on the internet, they will discover strategies that, potentially closely or not so closely approximate biology, and in particular, spatial feature-based attention and fields of that sort. My main goal is not necessarily to, drive the development of AI. To me, those we are at a turning point, maybe in human histories. Certainly, this is not something that I expected to witness during my lifetime. If you had asked me when I was a grad student, seeing those milestones where AI systems outperform humans on many visual recognition tasks is again something I wouldn't have expected to witness. And so my goal is to so I think there's an opportunity here in understanding how those systems what strategy they discover, how different data diet training strategies affect the strategy that they learn, in my opinion, can help us inform neuroscience. And so with the goal to really understand how biological vision works, I really see kind of in the parallel you're making, to me, it's this discussion, this two-way discussion between neuroscience and AI is really leaning towards understanding how biology works. Whether that's going to be a good analogy, whether these are going to be the right computations for kind of AI, I don't know, and to be honest.
Take a breath, Thomas. 1 second. We have 3 minutes left. Are there any more questions from here? Did you have one? Go ahead.
Hi, Thomas. My name is Shirazad. Thanks very much. It was really very interesting. My question has nothing to do with the core presentation, but with your writings and everything. I was wondering, in terms of reasoning, we read a lot about everything which has to do with world models, internal world models, and grounding mechanisms. So how, I would like to know how you see the combination of your work
Yeah.
with these two concerns who are very actual in modern AI.
Super question. So I showed you half of our work. So, you know, I showed you that there's this growing misalignment between scaled up AI and human primate vision. And so I think that there are two things that are happening here. On the one hand, and that was the focus of my talk, I tried to argue that you know, the architectural constraints that are shaping biological vision are very different from the architectural constraints that are taking place in AI systems. And so, you know, one way to address this is to force those feedback mechanisms, etc. So this is really kind of trying to align the two, you know, AI with human vision based on architectural constraints. Equally important, and something that we're working on, which I haven't touched on, is the need to align the systems in terms of the kinds of data diets that, you know, AI systems are trained with, and potentially the objective functions, you know, the learning training principles that are used to allow those models to soak up so much data. We have a whole line of research on this, which is really trying to discover learning developmental principles that help network to align better with the AI system. As part of this research agenda, we have found that some self-supervised learning objective and some data diets lead transformers and CNN equally to align better with the kinds of representation and strategies that are learned by humans. Now, we have a task. You might have heard about visual perspective taking, which is, you know, Piaget. It's used in the study of theory of mind. This is a task that require an observer to change their point of view and to figure out what's visible, invisible, to change reference frame from, you know, first person perspective to an arbitrary kind of perspective in the scene. We have shown that no current computer vision system, no AI model, including ChatGPT and all the frontier models, can solve this task. And so while we are doing progress, I think improving the data diet, training models on baby-like, you know, video data, improving the kind of training objective is certainly helping us align those models. This is not helping us get those models to solve those kinds of tasks. I think the missing ingredient for solving those tasks is the need for embodiment. And so we are developing a framework where we are allowing those models to be embodied agents and figure out the right way to interact with the world, to navigate the world, to manipulate objects, to encourage the discovery of world model mental simulation strategies that would spontaneously allow those models to learn those and discover those principles and mechanisms. And my guess is that if we, with the right embodiments, the right objective functions, we should get embodied agents which are now you know, much more grounded, able to solve those very high level visual reasoning tasks, including this visual perspective taking.
Thank you very much. You also mentioned Van Roelen, who is Ralph Van Roelen, who works a lot on GWT theories.
We're collaborating on the global workspace. We are part of the, we're part of the same chair in Toulouse. So our labs in Toulouse are working as one. So yes. Okay,
so it's going to be interesting in the future too, for what comes to your research.
Yes, and so the global workspace here, I mean, I guess the parallel is obvious. It's going to be a global workspace where motor, you know, a motor system, motor affordances are tightly coupled with visual representations. Yes, thank you for this question.
I came up just at the right moment because I was going to ask a question about the motor side of the equation. I want to thank you for your extremely rich and variegated talk.
Thank you so much.
It deserves being looked at attentively for a long time, and to go back to the literature that's cited with your talk. I want to thank you for coming to Montreal. And I think Van Roelen, we're going to have him next year, I hope. We're supposed to have him this year.
We had it already.
Oh yeah, sorry.
In fall.
He was the one who did come this year. Excuse me. It's been quite a sweep this year. with the touring people. I hope you'll come back to occasionally to see what the other people are saying, and the archive is available to you as well. Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank
you
you so much. Thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure being here.